That's the basic concept, but what are some of the, sort of practical things that you're actually going to run into when you try to do this? The first thing you're going to need is an appropriate shard key. You're going to need a shard key that includes some sort of specific information. In our case, it was region, so let's stick with that. So you can imagine that you've got a document that looks something like this. You've got an underscore ID in there. We have a user ID, perhaps. And then we've got other data. And we've got our region. This is the important part, for the tag at least. And that is set to, say, EMEA, like so. There may be more data in there. Also, we'll leave it at that. And so this is what your document looks like. One for the US. And so how would you construct a shard key here that makes sense? Well, let's think about the values that you want. You want to have region being an easy way to segregate the data. So I think what we'll go for is a compound shard key here. And let's say that for the most part we know that our queries are going to be based on the region and the user ID. So our compound shard key is going to start with region, and we're going to include user ID. And let's just say that there's some other field here that we are often going to be querying on or wanting to be selective on. So we're going to include that in here as well. And there's our shard key. So you can imagine that the ranges for this compound shard key that we've just created here, when these are concatenated together, you can imagine it look something like US. Let's say that we've got a sort of user ID hex based 321648, and then you've got some other data in here. So when you're looking at your ranges, this might be the start of a particular chunk range, and that will go up to US BE12846, whatever that might be, and you'll have a series of these up here, and a series down here. There'll be EMEA ones to EMEA ones, etc. So you can see how that might work out quite well. So you've got your fairly easily created ranges, or understandable ranges, based on this. Your user ID gives you a decent amount. There's high cardinality here for the shard keys. You're not going to run into giant chunks. There's plenty of ways to split those chunks up. And you know that you've included your most commonly used fields here in this shard key, so it'll be decent enough for actually executing queries. So once you've decided on that, there are then sort of two steps that you're going to need to take. You need to, first of all, assign tags to your shards. So we got 4 shards, shard 0001, 2, 3, and 4. And the first thing we have to do is designate them a particular region. We're going to do that by using the add shard tag command. So this I'll show it a quick example. So here's our test cluster that we've been using. Let's have a look at our sh.status. So we got 2 shards, test-rs0 and test-rs1. So what we're going to do is tag our rs0 one as US West, and then we're going to add a tag of US East to rs1. There we go. So let's have a look at our sh.status now. In our shards summary here, you can see that there's a tags value here, and it's an array. In this case, only one value in each, and we can see that rs0 has been tagged as US West, and rs1 has been tagged as US East, as we would expect. Now, just to show you, we're going to use config, and there you can see that's where the sh.status helper was pulling the information from. We have the tags in that array there, and we can add more of those in there, and you can have multiple tags for different shards, for different collections, and as it makes sense for you to actually segregate your data. So that is the shards tagged. So what we will say here is that this one is US. So you'll see that's the way we've decided to do our theoretical tagging. We showed you a quick example on our test cluster. Now that the shards themselves are actually tagged, what's the next step? Step 2 is that we need to actually tag the various ranges. So on the leftmost boundary of our shard key ranges is going to look something like this. So that'll be our first range, the min key to some value, some valid value in here, and then you can imagine there will be a subsequent one which will start at APAC, the same value that's here, and that will go to another chunk. Now, if we were being smart, what we would have done here is similar to how we pre-split that GUID-based key. What we would have done is created as many chunks as we thought were necessary. based on a combination of the region and this unique identifier, this user ID here. And what you would have done is you would have iterated through, you would have prepended the region string, so APAC, MIA. So you can imagine you might have had a for loop that would go through and say, for each value in this list, iterate through all of the values for the user ID, and then pad it out appropriately after that. So let's just quickly do it in pseudocode. If we were going to do that pre-split, let's see what that would actually look like. So here's our pseudocode. For each region that we've decided to designate here, we're going to loop through, and we've decided in this case that we just need 2 nested for loops, so 256 chunks a piece, which will give us over 1,000 total, so 1,024 total, spread across 4 regions. We're going to loop through those, again reusing some of the code that we saw earlier in our pre-splitting example. We're going to build up a prefix, which is region, plus the x and y values, which in our example we actually did a little function here to turn these into hex. You can imagine that that's just what's happening here. And then plus some padding to actually make it the required length for the particular shard key. And then we run the admin command to split on all of those boundaries. So what would that give us? Well, it would give us 1,024 chunks across 4 regions, 256 chunks each. So there we go. So once we've created all those things, the final remaining piece then is we would just iterate through in a very, very similar manner once these have all been created. And instead of running a split command, because it's already been done, what we'll be doing instead is we'll be running the sh.add tag range. And here I'm just making up a collection name, region-data.users or something similar. And you'd use the min and max values from your splits to actually assign those tag ranges. So the most obvious one, of course, would be the min key value up to whatever the first valid APAC would be. So your min is going to be your min key. Your max is going to be a valid value for APAC. And then the final thing that you pass in is the actual desired tag. So we'll call that one APAC. So you iterate through, you give your min and your max. So the next one would be this, goes on to become the min value, and another valid boundary becomes the max, and that would be APAC again. You keep iterating through until you've done your 256 for APAC. Then you move on to EMEA. You do another 256. And etc. 256 for US East, 256 for US West, and eventually you'll have tagged all of your ranges with the add tag range command. And when that's complete, you'll have basically your 4 shards, each one tagged appropriately for the ranges. You'll have 256 chunks assigned to each one.